Imagine a life where you and your other half have been in love all your life, and in old age you wait for time to take you away, but suddenly you are returned to your younger self. Now you can enjoy the fruits of life again. Well, this couple got just that. Will they feel their youth and be lively once again? The show begins by showing us to two hardworking elderly people. Shuzu was talking with his wife named Annie because you remember that when they were younger, they were very poor, so they couldn't even go on a honeymoon. But Annie didn't mind because sharing her life with Shuzu was more than enough for her. They both wanted to see the apple tree they had planted at their wedding, as the tree had split during a typhoon, and when they arrived, they noticed that it had one last apple, which was golden for some reason. As evening approached, Shuzu kept thinking that he had been richer in his youth, which made him cry because he wished he could have given his wife better things. But then he noticed in the mirror that his face was no longer the same. So he hurried to find Imi to tell her that he had the face of a young man. To his surprise, his wife had the same face. Without hesitation, he took her in his arms and asked her once and for all to go on a honeymoon. In a complete scene change, we see a girl named Mino, who is the granddaughter of these two grandparents, visiting them. She was surprised to find that her grandparents had drastically changed from old people to super young people, which confused her. However, she knew that they were her grandparents and started to ask Shuzu not to cut his hair because the bangs looked good on him. Mino also wanted to ask her grandmother for a favor, as she wanted to borrow her grandfather for a while, but Inni quickly refused. When it was time to return home, Mino started talking to her father about rejuvenating her grandparents. However, her father didn't understand what she meant and eventually ignored her. Later, we see a group of elderly people playing together, wondering about Amy and Shuzu since they hadn't come to play for a while. Instead, they had a new strange player who seemed to have charmed all the grandmothers with his good looks. Amy appeared to talk to the two old people, offering them tea and telling them that she had rejuvenated herself and that the handsome man they were seeing was Shuzu. This surprised the old man so much that he spilled tea on his clothes, which Inni had to clean up, making the old man nervous and almost giving him a heart attack. After that, we see a conversation between Yoshiaki, who is Shuzu's son, and Mino's father. Yoshiaki wanted to take care of them in his own house because he knew that due to his father's age, it would be safest for them to live surrounded by family. But Shuzu had no intention of leaving his home, as these lands had been cared for by many generations before him. The only way to end this discussion was for Amy to apologize to Yoshiaki's wife, Cade. However, Cade seemed indifferent to her decision and asked the kind old lady what she preferred. Without hesitation, Amy assured him that as long as she could be with her husband, she didn't care about anything else. The next day, Cade returned with more ingredients for the food Amy had requested. But when she entered the house, she met an attractive man who turned out to be Shuzu. Without much to do, she went into a room to think things over, because he was incredibly handsome. Eventually, she calmed down while Yoshiaki felt a chill that was actually her female intuition at its peak. When she returned with Ki, she brought her husband with her, who couldn't believe that his parents had really rejuvenated themselves so much. Finally, he understood Mino's words when she said that they were rejuvenated, which was why she pretended that her grandfather was her boyfriend. Kaid was also scolded for not informing Yoshiaki earlier, but Mino didn't waste any time and went to hug her rejuvenated grandfather. Her mother asked her to let go since a grandparent-grandchild relationship was obviously more than forbidden. But at the end of the day, poor Shuzu got a good slap on the cheek while his son said goodbye and promised to come back later. Annie took the moment to ask him not to work so hard and also to pat Yoshiaki's head, because when you're an adult, no one congratulates you for your achievements. This reminded Yoshiaki of the past, when his mother praised him for his good grades in school, and now the present only holds his feelings. Mina wanted the same affection as well, so she ended up receiving a lot of congratulations. The next morning, the sports festival was the topic of discussion as the elders wondered what they could do to attract more people. When they merged the nearby schools into one, the neighborhood was left with no children and only elderly people, who obviously wouldn't risk a heart attack, remained. Not to mention that Igarashi won every year, so maybe it's better to skip it this year. But when they saw the new Shuzu with all his powerful muscles, they were surprised because he was the savior who came to help them. Since the grandmother could not refuse, he was forced to participate in the neighborhood festival. During the festival, an old man came with his two grandsons, Igarashi Shouda and Igarashi Deki, who would also be competing. They just scoffed at how easy it would be to win that day. However, one of the older men named Sana was tired and revealed that they had a secret weapon to fight them this year, the Sido. Hizu could only laugh, knowing that they would use those two against his strong grandsons. But when he saw how muscular Shuzu was up close, he couldn't help but think that he was actually the grandson of the elder. However, they revealed that they were the original Saido. The first game was a tug-of-war, and although the two young men used all their strength, they were only fighting against an extremely powerful being. But grandfather knew it wouldn't last long because they were still at a disadvantage. He also saw how they tried to make his wife a cheerleader for their team, so with much embarrassment, she accepted and started cheering, activating 110% of the elders and making it clear who won the first few games by a significant margin. Ain's embarrassment was not in vain. In the second game, we see that Shota wants to avenge the first defeat and does everything he can to reach the finish line first. Hizuki in the distance couldn't be happier knowing that victory was all his, and he was also glad to have exercised for 10 years. Meanwhile, our favorite couple just took the baton and therefore had a significant disadvantage against Hizuki's grandchildren, who were practically about to beat them. But the power and coordination of the Citus were simply superior, so they quickly surpassed the young athletes. The grandfather knew it would be easy, as he had spent more than 70 years with his wife and of course knew her rhythm by heart. Without further ado, the winners were also the Citus. In the next game, eyeing without even looking and without standing out among the others, they carried the big ball between them, which sounds very bad. The young ones were surprised not to be at the level of an exercise for older people. When they took a break to eat something, Shota became very reflective because he knew he still had many things to improve, and Deki just hoped that no one he knew was watching because it would be the most humiliating moment of his life. Meanwhile, their grandfather Hisu couldn't have been more annoying as they made a fool of his beloved grandchildren. And it wasn't just a victory of the present, since Hizuki remembered 70 years ago when Shuzu stole Ein from him, and now in the present he stole hope from his grandchildren. So he congratulated them. Likewise, In appeared to apologize for not controlling herself, and Hizuki asked if it was really okay for her not to be with Shuzu. But the grandmother knew she had nothing to do with him, or at least not now that he was so popular, where most likely he would just be in the way among so many people feeding them. She showed what she had brought to share with everyone, so she started to eat with Hizuki while he told things from the past, like 70 years ago he lost his wife and couldn't believe that he had left his little grandchildren alone. But to cheer him up, In assured him that his grandchildren resembled him when he was younger. He couldn't help but remember the day he had proposed to her, so his two grandchildren better understood why he was so eager to win this event. Before he left, En offered them a rematch next year, so the grandsons immediately understood the reason why they rejected their grandfather. In a brief flashback, we see how young Hizuki looked. Now we see how a week passed and Shota finally got a mission from his grandfather, which was to deliver an order to the status house. But when Mino opened the door, she recognized him as her classmate, and he couldn't have been more nervous. Trembling, he handed Mino his grandfather's order, and she invited him in for a while. Although the young man agreed, he soon regretted it because he was extremely nervous. He could only say that he didn't know that she was the granddaughter of the grandparents who beat him in the sports festival. But deep down, Shota acted this way because Mino was the most popular girl among the boys, and being alone with her was so difficult that he just wanted to kill time with his phone. However, Mino seemed interested, and they started talking a lot more. Meanwhile, Ain and Keed watched from a distance. Keed quickly thought that her daughter already had a boyfriend, so in a year she would surely have grandchildren, and the problems would begin. But when the grandfather appeared, he was very kind to the young man, thanking him for taking the time to bring him some food. Shota couldn't believe that his rival's grandfather was so kind, while the two women in front of him were not. When Shota left, his grandfather couldn't help but notice that Shota wanted to talk to him more. He could only ignore it while Shota asked his grandfather to ask him to bring more things to their house later. Meanwhile, Mino listened as her grandfather confessed his love to her grandmother. In the past, marrying whomever you wanted was very complicated because of tradition. That's why her grandfather had to fight with his father for arranging a marriage he didn't want. With the help of Ein, who practically threatened the young woman never to interfere with her husband, they ended up together. But Mino wanted her grandmother to reenact the moment when she spoke to her opponent. With no other option, her grandmother agreed to do it, even though her husband was watching and was very embarrassed. She knew she had to do it for her granddaughter and ended up threatening the woman never to touch her husband, which impressed everyone in the room. Mino thanked her for the lesson. Did you like this one? If you did, we can hop onto the next few episodes later next week.